February 10th, 1993. 90 million people around the world stopped what they were doing, leaned toward their television screens, and held their breath. It was the most watched interview in television history at the time. And the man at the center of it hadn't sat down for a real conversation on camera in 14 years. Michael Jackson, the biggest star the world had ever known. A man who sold out stadiums on every continent, whose albums broke every record ever set, whose face was recognized in villages that didn't even have running electricity. He had everything money could buy. Fame beyond imagination. Talent that bordered on the supernatural. And yet, on this particular night, sitting in a quiet room at his Neverland ranch, he looked less like a king and more like a boy who had been asked to open a door he'd kept locked for 30 years. Across from him sat Oprah Winfrey, and she was about to ask the one question the entire world wanted answered. The question reporters had chased him with for decades. The question he had dodged, deflected, and disappeared from again and again. She was going to ask him about his childhood. But what Michael said about his childhood in the next 90 seconds would make a hardened television crew. People who had filmed wars, tragedies, and 1,000 celebrity confessions go completely silent. If you love these untold stories, hit like, subscribe, and drop the city you're watching from in the comments right now. You have to understand what made this moment so impossibly tense. Michael Jackson did not do interviews. He had spent his entire adult life building walls. Not because he was hiding something sinister, but because the world had taken so much from him that silence had become the only thing he could truly own. Every word he said became a headline. Every sentence got twisted. So he stopped speaking publicly almost entirely. For 14 years, the most famous voice in music said almost nothing at all. And now here he was, cameras rolling, the world watching, no script. No producers feeding him answers, no place to hide. Oprah leaned in. The room felt smaller somehow, as if the air itself had tightened. And she's asked him gently but directly what his childhood had really been like. For a moment, Michael said nothing. He looked down. His hands moved slightly in his lap. And the people in that room would later say that something shifted in his face. The polished superstar mask slipped just for a second, and underneath it was something raw. Something that looked an awful lot like pain. Because here was the cruel irony of Michael Jackson's entire existence. This was a man who had given the world joy. He made people dance. He made people cry tears of happiness. He made millions of strangers feel less alone. He had quite literally more than any human being could ever dream of. But the one thing he wanted, the one thing he could never, ever get back, was the very thing Oprah had just asked him about, a childhood. A normal, ordinary, simple childhood. The kind where a boy plays in the street until the streetlights come on. The kind with birthday parties and scraped knees and lazy summer afternoons doing absolutely nothing at all. Michael Jackson, the man who could buy entire amusement parks, would have traded all of it. Every gold record, every screaming fan, every dollar for just one of those ordinary days. And in that quiet room with 90 million people watching, he was finally going to say it out loud. The crew braced themselves. Oprah waited. And what came next wasn't a rehearsed answer. It wasn't a celebrity managing his image. It was a confession that had been buried for 30 years, finally rising to the surface in front of the entire world. People who watched it live still remember exactly where they were. They remember the lump that formed in their throats. They remember reaching for the remote and being unable to look away. Because in that single moment, the most famous person on the planet stopped being a superstar and became simply a human being, aching for something he'd lost before he ever got the chance to have it. But to understand why his answer hit so hard, why it broke the hearts of millions, and why people still talk about it today, you have to go back to the very beginning. You have to go back to a little boy in Gary, Indiana, 1958. It was a working-class steel town, gray skies, smokestacks on the horizon, and rows of small houses packed close together. The Jackson family lived in one of them, a tiny two-bedroom house on Jackson Street, ironically enough. 9 children, hard-working parents, not much money. And inside those cramped walls, something extraordinary was beginning to take shape. Michael was the 8th of 9 children, born in August of 1958. And almost from the time he could walk, it was clear he was different. By the age of 5, he was already singing lead. By the time most children were learning to read, Michael was learning stage choreography, vocal control, and how to command an audience. While the other kids in the neighborhood were outside playing, riding bikes, chasing each other through the streets, doing all the ordinary, beautiful, meaningless things that children do, Michael was inside, rehearsing for hours, then more. This is the part of the story that fame tends to erase. We see the dazzling performances, the perfect harmonies, the Jackson 5 exploding onto the world stage. What we don't see is the cost. Because every one of those flawless performances was built on a foundation of childhood that was being quietly, steadily traded away. Michael himself would describe it later, again and again, in his own words. He talked about looking out the window during rehearsals and seeing other children playing in the park across the street. He could hear them laughing. He could see them running. And he wasn't allowed to join them. He had to practice. He had to be perfect. There was a show to do, a record to make, a family depending on him. Imagine that for a moment. A small boy pressing his face to the glass, watching what a normal childhood looked like, and knowing it belonged to everyone but him. He missed the playgrounds. He missed the birthday parties. He missed the simple freedom of just being a kid with nothing to do and nowhere to be. By the time he was 10 years old, Michael Jackson was a seasoned professional performer who had played countless shows, including the rough, demanding clubs of the Chitlin circuit. 10 years old and already carrying the weight of an adult career on his small shoulders. And here is the heartbreaking contrast at the center of his entire life. As his fame grew, he became, eventually, the single most famous person on earth. The gap between what he had and what he'd lost only grew wider. He had millions of fans. He had wealth most people couldn't comprehend. He had the adoration of the entire world. But he never got to be a child. You cannot go back. That's the cruel truth of it. There is no amount of money, no level of fame, no number of sold-out stadiums that can give a grown man back the afternoons he spent rehearsing instead of playing. And Michael knew this. He felt the absence of it every single day of his adult life. Which brings us to Neverland. People made jokes about it. The press mocked it. But almost nobody stopped to ask the obvious, aching question. Why would a grown man build a ranch with a Ferris wheel, a carousel, a zoo, a movie theater, and rides scattered across hundreds of acres? The answer is devastatingly simple. He told us himself, over and over. He built it because he never had it. Neverland wasn't an eccentric indulgence. It was a man trying desperately to reconstruct the childhood that had been taken from him. Every ride, every animal, every attraction was a piece of the boyhood he'd watched through a window but was never allowed to live. He named it after Peter Pan, the boy who never grew up. And that wasn't an accident either. Michael identified with that story on the deepest possible level, because in a very real way, he was a man searching his whole life for the childhood he'd skipped, trying to fill a hole that had been carved into him before he was even old enough to understand it. That was the wound he carried, quiet, private, buried under decades of fame and noise and performance. A wound that he almost never spoke about, because speaking about it meant feeling it all over again. So when Oprah leaned in and asked the question, that simple, gentle question about his childhood, she didn't know she was touching the deepest wound he had. Let's go back to that room at Neverland. The cameras were set. The lighting was soft. Outside, beyond the walls, 90 million people were waiting. But inside, it was just the two of them. Michael and Oprah, sitting close, the rest of the world held at a strange and quiet distance. You could see Michael's nervousness. It wasn't the polished confidence of a man who'd performed for billions. It was something far more human. He sat carefully. He chose his words slowly. There was a fragility to him, a sense that he was bracing for something. Because he knew what was coming. He knew that the moment he opened this door, there would be no closing it again. The whole world would see inside. Oprah eased into it gently. She didn't pounce. She talked to him like a person, not a headline. And then carefully, she guided the conversation toward the place Michael had spent his whole life avoiding, his childhood and his father. She asked him about Joe Jackson, about the rehearsals, about what it was really like growing up in that house, under that pressure, with that man. And something changed in Michael's face. What he admitted next he had never said on camera before. He began to talk about the fear, about how, as a child, he had been so frightened of his father that he would sometimes get physically sick, that he would feel nauseous, regurgitate, just at the sight of him. Think about the weight of that admission. The most famous entertainer alive, sitting in front of 90 million people, confessing that as a little boy he had been so afraid that his own body recoiled. He talked about how he idolized his father and feared him at the same time. How Joe was a strict disciplinarian who pushed them relentlessly. And how Michael, even as a grown man with all the success in the world, still carried that fear inside him like a splinter that had never come out. If this is moving you, take 1 second to like, subscribe, and tell us your city in the comments. We read every single one. But then Oprah went deeper. She asked him about the loneliness, and this is where the room went quiet. Michael talked about crying. He admitted, openly, with no mask, no performance, that there were times he felt so alone that he would cry. The man surrounded by millions of adoring fans, the man whose name was known in every corner of the planet, confessed that loneliness had followed him his entire life. He spoke about how, in the early days, he had felt isolated even within his own family. How fame had not filled the emptiness, it had deepened it. He said that sometimes he would walk through his neighborhood, or try to, and the feeling of not belonging, of being apart from everyone, never left him. He had everything, and he had nothing. He was adored by the world and yet profoundly, achingly alone. You have to picture the people watching this. Crew members standing just off camera who had seen everything in their careers. Technicians, producers, hardened professionals. And one by one, they fell silent, not because they were told to, but because what they were witnessing was so raw, so unguarded, so completely without pretense, that it silenced the room on its own. This wasn't a celebrity managing a story. This wasn't a rehearsed soundbite designed to win sympathy. This was a human being finally setting down a weight he had carried, alone for 30 years, and in that moment, the legend disappeared. The moonwalk disappeared. The sequin glove, the records, the screaming stadiums, all of it disappeared. What remained was just a man. A man who had been a little boy once watching other children play through a window, and who had never, ever stopped missing that. His voice grew softer, his eyes glistened, and 90 million people, watching from their living rooms across the world, felt something crack open in their own chests, because they recognized it. Not the fame, almost none of them knew fame, but the loneliness, the longing, the ache of wanting something you can never get back. That everyone understood. That was the moment the entire world stopped seeing Michael Jackson as untouchable. But what people realized in the hours and days that followed, the thing that turned this from a sad interview into something that broke hearts across the entire planet, that was something else entirely. So why did this moment land the way it did? Celebrities cry on camera all the time. The world has seen 1,000 tearful confessions, 1,000 carefully timed emotional moments. Most of them we forget within a week. But this one stayed. Decades later, people still talk about it. They still feel it. And to understand why, you have to understand what made it different. It was the gap. There has never been, before or since, a gap quite like the one between who the world thought Michael Jackson was and who he revealed himself to be that night. To the public, Michael wasn't even fully human. He was a phenomenon, an icon so untouchable, so otherworldly, that people genuinely struggled to imagine him doing ordinary things. Eating breakfast, feeling tired, sitting alone in a quiet room. He existed in a category beyond regular people. He was the closest thing the modern world had to a living myth. And then, in a single conversation, that myth set down everything he was carrying and showed the world the frightened little boy underneath. That contrast is what shattered people. Because when someone you assumed had everything, every advantage, every comfort, every dream fulfilled, quietly tells you that the one thing he wanted most was something so simple, so ordinary, so available to almost everyone except him, it rearranges something inside you. It forces you to confront a truth that's easy to forget but impossible to unknow. Fame cannot give you back a childhood. Money cannot buy the afternoons you never got to waste. The richest man in the world can still be the loneliest. The most adored human on the planet can still cry himself to sleep feeling like no one truly knows him. We tell ourselves constantly that if we just had enough success, enough money, enough recognition, then we'd finally be happy. Michael Jackson had more of all of it than nearly anyone in human history. And he sat there and told us plainly that it had not filled the hole, that the hole was still there, that it had always been there. That's a terrifying and beautiful thing to hear. Terrifying because it dismantles the lie we comfort ourselves with. Beautiful because it reminds us that the things that actually matter, love, belonging, a sense of being known, the simple freedom to be a child, were never the things money could buy in the first place. And here is what separated this from every hollow celebrity moment that came before it. Michael wasn't performing his pain. He gained nothing by saying these things. There was no album to promote in that confession, no image to polish. If anything, it made him more vulnerable, more exposed, more open to the cruelty he'd spent his whole life trying to avoid. He told the truth because, after 30 years, the truth finally needed somewhere to go. That's what real humanity looks like. Not the flawless performer, not the untouchable legend, but the moment a person finally lets the world see the wound they've been hiding and trusts that maybe, just maybe, they'll be met with compassion instead of cruelty. And the world did meet him with compassion. In living rooms across the planet, people cried. Parents pulled their own children a little closer. Grown men who had never shed a tear over a celebrity in their lives found their throats tightening. Because everyone, no matter how rich or poor, no matter what country they were watching from, understood the ache of longing for something lost. Everyone has, somewhere inside them, a window they once looked through, watching a life they couldn't quite reach. For one night, 90 million strangers felt the exact same thing at the exact same time. And that shared feeling, that collective recognition of one man's pain as a reflection of something in themselves, that's a kind of magic that almost never happens. Michael had spent his whole life making people feel joy through his music. That night, without singing a single note, he made the entire world feel something even deeper. He made them feel seen. And in being so honest about his own brokenness, he gave millions of people silent permission to acknowledge their own. That's not weakness. That's one of the bravest things a human being can do. But here's the part that elevates this from a sad interview to something people would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Because the most powerful part wasn't what he said on screen, it was what people realized afterward. What did people realize in the hours and days and years after that interview? They realized that behind every icon, there is a human story. And usually, it's a story far more fragile than the legend lets on. We build our heroes up into something superhuman. We see the awards, the records, the magazine covers, and we assume that the person behind them must be invincible. That success on that scale must surely come with happiness on the same scale. But it almost never works that way. The brighter the spotlight, the deeper the shadows it casts. And Michael Jackson, the most luminous star of his generation, lived in some of the deepest shadows of all. The lesson buried in that quiet conversation at Neverland is one of the most important and most ignored truths a person can learn. Success does not heal what was broken in childhood. Achievement is not the same as wholeness. You can win the entire world and still be quietly grieving the boy or girl you never got to be. The wounds we carry from our earliest years don't disappear when the bank account fills up or the crowd starts cheering. They wait, they follow us. And no amount of external success will ever reach the places that only love, time, and healing can touch. Michael spent his whole life trying to outrun that truth. He built a ranch full of rides. He surrounded himself with the trappings of the childhood he'd lost. He chased it across decades. But you cannot rebuild what time has already taken. And somewhere deep down, he knew it. And yet, and this is the part that matters most, when he finally stopped running, when he sat in that room and let the whole world see the wound instead of hiding it, something remarkable happened. He didn't become smaller. He became bigger, more real, more beloved. Because vulnerability, it turns out, is its own kind of strength. It takes nothing to perform invincibility. It takes everything to admit you are hurting. That night, Michael Jackson didn't lose his crown. He earned a different one, the quiet human dignity of a man who finally told the truth. And in doing so, he gave a gift to 90 million strangers. He showed them that it's okay to ache for what you've lost, that it's okay to admit you're lonely, even when your life looks perfect from the outside. That being honest about your pain isn't a weakness to hide, it's a bridge to everyone else who's hurting too. So let's go back to where we started. A quiet room at Neverland, the cameras rolling, the world watching. A man who had everything, being asked about the one thing he could never get back. We began with the superstar, the legend, the myth, the untouchable king of pop. But that's not who answered the question. The one who answered was the little boy. The boy in Gary, Indiana, pressing his face to the window, listening to other children laugh in a park he wasn't allowed to enter. The boy who rehearsed while the rest of the world played. The boy who grew into the most famous man alive and still after everything just wanted one ordinary afternoon to be a kid. That boy never left him. That boy was sitting on the couch beside Oprah the entire time. And for the first time in his life, in front of the whole world, he got to speak. That's the part that breaks your heart. Not the fame, not the tragedy that would come later, but the simple, human truth that the most celebrated entertainer who ever lived would have traded all of it. Every record, every dollar, every screaming fan, for the one thing the rest of us so often take for granted, a normal childhood, a few carefree afternoons, the chance to just be a kid. So here's the question I want to leave you with tonight. The question that stays with you long after the screen goes dark. If you could reach back through time, past the fame, past the legend, past all of it, and give that little boy in Gary, Indiana just one ordinary afternoon to be a kid.
Would you?
If this story's touched you, subscribe, and let us know the city you're watching from in the comments below.